Hey y'all, it's Kathleen,
and MC.
your two favorite winos.
It's that time again, so grab a glass.
Or a bottle.
Unless you're driving, and let's get weird.
This podcast contains adult content and crime details which might not be suitable for all listeners.
Please drink responsibly.
Hey guys, I want to start off this episode by saying thank you so much for tuning into last week's episode and giving us all of your honest feedback. We're so excited to officially be on most of the major podcast platforms such as Anchor, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and now Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it from the bottom of our hearts and would love it so much if you would rate and review us so we could see what you think. I cannot contain my excitement for this wine portion of this episode today. Not only is the wine delicious, it's allowed me to explore a category that until now I was not familiar with, natural wine. I want to throw a huge shout out to Stefan, Dave, and Brett over at Toast here in Norfolk, Virginia for introducing us to some incredible natural wines. If you're like me, I wasn't exactly sure what natural wines meant. I mean, I could gather a few assumptions that it had to do with limiting the chemicals used to produce those wines, which is true, but it goes so much deeper than that. While there's no specific guidelines or rules for natural wines, the basic idea is wine made with nothing added to it and nothing taken away from it. The grapes are grown using organic or biodynamic farming practices. What you get to taste is the hard work of the hands that put in so much time, love, and knowledge into creating these wines. There are more than 72 official and perfectly legal additives that can be added into conventional wines, none of which you'll find on the labels. In natural wine, the only additive that can sometimes occur is sulfite as a preservative, but ideally there would be none, resulting in a 0-0 wine. When it comes to natural wine, it really begins in the vineyard. The terroir is the natural environment where the vines live and everything that impacts the flavor of the wine. This can be anything from the soil and irrigation to the climate and topography. Natural wines are also hand-picked and fermented only using native yeast found on the vine. The wine is then bottled with little to no filtering or fining. There's a bit of misconception that natural wines are all funky, cloudy, or fuzzy. While sure, some natural wines can be described this way, this only applies to some. A lot of natural wines can taste very much like the normal wine you're used to drinking, but there's a lot more creative freedom to produce a very interesting and exciting wine that pretty much tastes like absolutely anything and everything the winemakers want it to taste like. A lot of the time, the winemakers try not to disturb the vines too much so that the wine can naturally do what it wants. The cool part is that many things that conventional winemakers may consider a flaw can be very intentional and an appreciated flavor in the natural wine. So throw everything you think you know about wine out of the window, grab a few bottles of natural wine, and get ready to expect the unexpected. Today we have a true crime case for you all the way from Germany, so it's only fitting that we bring you a German wine. Master winemaker Eric Weber and his family farm about 22 acres of mainly old Riesling vines in the side valley of the Saar in Germany. If you've never heard of Hofgut Falkenstein, stop and Google it right now. The vineyard is absolutely gorgeous. All of their grapes are hand harvested, gently pressed for a few hours, and then the must is left overnight to settle naturally and then is vinified with ambient yeast in 1,000-liter oak casks. Even though the Weber family specializes in Rieslings, their Hofgut Falkenstein 2017 dry red does not disappoint. We uncork this wine about 20 minutes before enjoying, per recommendation of our sommelier buddy Brett. This delicious wine is sourced from 25-year-old Pinot Noir vines, which is probably why we like it so much. These grapes undergo spontaneous fermentation, and then the wine is aged for 18 months. This wine is dry, bright, and fresh. I taste a strong berry, lingonberry, almost cranberry immediately. What do you?
I'm definitely getting some blackberry, maybe a little bit of fig, some dates. And even when I first opened the bottle, I nosed the bottle and immediately got a strong smell of like a sourdough loaf, like a fresh loaf of bread. But the taste for me was dry, but it wasn't overly dry. It was very light, which I liked. Definitely that tart cranberry. Got some hint of oak, but the cranberry was overwhelming. Almost, it reminded me of Thanksgiving over with my grandmother Roe, and she would make a fresh cranberry sauce. We would have the can, but some of us like the fresh sauce that she made from scratch. And that's what it reminded me of, just because there wasn't a lot of added sugar to it. So it was always like kind of tart. And that's really what I'm getting. I did kind of get that hint of vinegar on the nose, but nothing on the palate.
I agree totally. I get almost like an oaky flavor on the end and like a slightly vinegar, bittery, like a green olive.
Hmm.
It's medium to light in body, making this wine super refreshing and juicy, yet also warm and perfect for fall. I could honestly drink this just about any time, but it's recommended to be paired with roasted salmon, rustic mushroom dishes, charcuterie, and even winter squash soups. I know what I'm bringing to Thanksgiving this year.
Holy moly, like this is Thanksgiving in a glass.
Yep, 100%. This wine and many, many others can be purchased here locally at Toast for $44. They have an incredible natural wine selection that you definitely need to see for yourself. If you're not local to Hampton Roads, don't worry. This wine will be available soon on their website, which we'll link in our show notes and let you guys know as soon as it's up and running. Now, let's get into the crime. I'm going to turn the mic over to MC so she can kick things off. Just so you guys know, this week's episode is extremely graphic in nature and contains sexual abuse and violence against minors.
Vampires. The things that our childhood nightmares are made of. They suck your blood in dark alleyways, only to leave you for dead. At least, that's what we think to be true. Thanks to pop culture movies like Dracula, based on Bram Stoker's 1897 classic horror novel, or the widely popular HBO series True Blood. However, the tales of these mythological creatures originated long before vampires were winning Oscars. Vampires originated in the early 17th and 18th century folklore. The stories of these monsters spread rapidly throughout Eastern Europe and then to England and Germany, where they were subsequently embellished. Across legend, we know vampires to be seductive and allure their victims using the power of desire. Another key trait of these creatures is their bite. The bite that allows them to feed off of their victims until there is nothing left. However, in the 19th century, a German man named Fritz Haarmann would bring this ancient folklore to the forefront of every popular news outlet in Europe. He would claim more than 24 victims, but it was his method that earned Haarmann his gruesome moniker. The scene is 1900s Germany, a time when the culture was split between a conservative, authoritarian, business-driven group and a working class. Soon, a world war would commence that would ultimately lead to the implosion of the German people. In a small municipality in Lower Saxony, Hanover was one of the cities most affected. It was in this little sleepy hollow that one of the most extraordinary series of modern-day crimes was committed by a name that will come to be known as the Vampire of Hanover. Friedrich Henrik Karl Haarmann, or Fritz, as we will call him, was the youngest of 6 children, born on October 25th, 1879. His mother, Johanna, was 41 when she gave birth to Fritz, which is still considered high risk, even by our modern definition. So naturally, she was excited to welcome their 6th child into the world. Johanna was known to spoil and dote on her youngest son. Contrastively, Fritz's father, Ollie Haarmann, was an ill-tempered man who was a notorious womanizer. He was also significantly younger than Johanna and was said to have only married her for her parents' wealth, although the evidence indicates that they were, in fact, still pretty poor. Johanna tried to make up for Ollie's shortcomings by babying Fritz, often to the point of embarrassment. In fact, she treated him nearly identically to his sisters. She encouraged him to play with dolls and dress in their clothes. I think it's safe to say that this was probably extremely confusing for the young Fritz. I hesitate to categorize this as maltreatment, but it could certainly have had some lasting effects on how he viewed himself. On the other hand, Ollie and Fritz had a tumultuous relationship from the very beginning. They repeatedly argued and even threatened one another on occasion. It seemed that the two most notable anecdotes relating to Fritz's childhood showed two distinct traits. The first is the unique feminine tendencies that were exhibited throughout his early years. The second is the pleasure of causing fear. He would sometimes tap on the windows late at night and scare his sisters just for fun. In school, Fritz was described by his teachers to be overall well behaved. His studies, on the other hand, were another story. He didn't seem to excel as quickly and ended up having to repeat several grades. Fritz also claimed to have been molested by a teacher when he was 8, but never discussed this again in detail. However, it's important to note that since the 1900s, there have been multiple studies conducted on the correlation between abuse and crime. According to an article in the U.S. National Library of Medicine, quote, psychological explanations for the relationship between child maltreatment and crime are typically derived from three theoretical perspectives: social control theory, social learning theory, and social psychological strain theory. Social control theory assumes that individuals have a natural tendency towards crime and violence, which is restrained by their social bonds. By disrupting these bonds, maltreatment by caregivers makes individuals more likely to offend. Social learning theory maintains that victims of maltreatment learn and adopt patterns of violent or delinquent behavior through processes of imitation and modeling. Finally, social psychological strain theory, or SPST, focuses on maltreatment as a source of acute stress. Many studies examine the relationships between maltreatment and outcomes such as behavior problems, developmental delays, and changes in brain functioning. These studies suggest that maltreatment could predispose a child to risky, self-destructive, or aggressive behaviors. End quote. If Fritz was, in fact, molested, I'd be willing to bet that this played a large role in his psychological development. All right, so I think this entire first part needs a discussion. So I think we should at least talk about how we think that these three theories are applicable to Fritz. The social control theory assumes that individuals have a natural tendency towards crime and violence, which is restrained by their social bonds. And an interruption in those social bonds could then lead to the individual committing crime. So for Fritz, I think that the poor relationship he had with his father, that social bond that was strained from an early age, could have led him to commit crime later on. Social learning theory maintains that victims of maltreatment learn and adopt patterns of violent or delinquent behavior through processes of imitation and modeling. So for this particular theory, could have been that he was imitating or modeling after his molester. Then for the social psychological strain theory, the stress from the trauma of being molested could have led him to commit violent acts as well. So I think all three of those are applicable to his situation. I thought this was interesting. In a study conducted in 1995 by the National Institution of Justice, all types of childhood abuse and neglect put the victims at higher risk for criminal behavior. However, the particular type of victimization suffered by children who are sexually abused does not set them apart. It does not put them at an even higher risk of arrest, for they are no more likely than children who are physically abused or neglected to be charged with a crime later in life. The same is true for sex crimes. People victimized by sexual abuse as children are also significantly more likely than non-victims to be arrested for a sex crime, although no more so than the victims of physical abuse and neglect. So I think what we can deduct from this is that correlation does not always equal causation. There are plenty of children that have been sexually abused that didn't commit crimes, but I think that we can deduce that there is a definite correlation between sexual or physical abuse and whether or not that child would have a predisposition to commit the crime or a crime.
I feel like we hear that a lot in crimes like this, or people who are abusers. It's kind of what they were taught, or as they were growing up, it's something that happened to them. And you have to, I mean, not that it's understandable, but you have to think about these children are trying to form. And, when something so terrible has happened to them while they're growing and while they are developing, it kind of makes sense that they would go on to do the same exact behaviors as adults.
Also, too, I think it's important to note that in the 1900s, even up until the 20th century, there wasn't a lot of research in this department.
Mm-hmm.
They were just now opening these state prisons. I call them prisons, these state asylums that were dedicated to the mentally ill, but there wasn't a lot of research and funding behind looking into why these kinds of things were happening.
That's true. And it's like back then, like you said, there wasn't a lot of research, but it also wasn't something that people talked about a lot like it is now, where these children are probably told, hey, don't tell somebody that I'm doing this to you or I'm going to kill you or whatever. Where now I think it's a little more, it's not more of a problem, but it's talked about a lot more. And so I feel like nowadays someone would hopefully feel a little more comfortable coming out about these things where it's allowing them to heal and hopefully preventing them from doing this again to somebody else.
Absolutely. I think you're right on track with the social acceptance factor of all this, which means, society wasn't talking about this. They weren't trying to treat it because they didn't know how. Half of the people probably didn't even know it was going on because it just wasn't talked about.
Right.
So I think you are right on track with that. After a while, his parents, mainly his father, were seemingly fed up with his behavior and sent him off to military school. At first, he did well and took to the military lifestyle. It wasn't long, though, before the 15-year-old Fritz started to suffer from periodic lapses in consciousness, which would subsequently be diagnosed as being the equivalent to epilepsy. This seemed to take a toll on the young Fritz, and to his dismay, he was soon back at home, living and working for his father in a cigar factory, which, let's be honest, if I were him, I'd rather be at a military school scrubbing the floors with a toothbrush too. Even though he hated working for his father, he was having fewer medical issues, which his mother counted as a blessing. He was now 16 and starting to explore his sexuality. But unfortunately, this is when Fritz Haarmann's life took a very dark turn. He started engaging in other types of behavior that far exceeded his simple medical diagnosis. Fritz had now begun molesting children. By all accounts, Fritz didn't just molest a single child. He molested multiple children. He would lure them into secluded areas like cellars and then proceed to sexually abuse them. It wasn't long before the accusations against him began to mount, and he was arrested and sent to a mental asylum just after his 18th birthday. It was at this insane asylum that Fritz would later recall as some of the most traumatic experiences of his life. Although, it isn't known what exactly happened to him there. I think we should discuss late 18th century and early 19th century insane asylums and the alternative forms of treatment that were oftentimes, in my opinion, very dangerous. I think it's important to note that most of the people being treated at these asylums were shunned from society. Oftentimes, before these asylums were even a thing, family members were responsible for taking care of them. So once the states began to implement state-funded facilities, they were sent there, and oftentimes it was against their will. And if you have looked at any of those pictures of these early 18th and 19th century asylums, you can see them in shackles, in chains, sitting in hallways. Oftentimes they were grouped like 5 of them at a time in one bed.
Oh my gosh.
It's sickening. And in the early days of mental hospitals, not everyone chose to enter one. Up until the 1960s, the majority of asylum patients were admitted involuntarily. And just to give you an idea, about 71% of those people in psychiatric institutions today are voluntary patients.
It's almost like their family or whoever was taking care of them, they were just like, hey, they're unmanageable and take them. I need help. Like they're crazy or whatever.
Well, and yeah, and they didn't have that choice before, right? So
crazy.
Now that these places are opened up by the state, and the state is taking a closer look into mental deficiencies, now there's places for these people to go. But they weren't hotels, they weren't even hospitals by any stretch of the imagination.
Nothing glamorous about that.
No, not at all. And not to mention, the treatments that we're talking about at this time period were completely inhumane. Most often, the doctors could not identify the cause of their melancholy or mania. In the early 1900s, it was common for doctors to use a wheel to spin patients at high speed and brand their patients to, quote, bring them to their senses.
Oh my goodness.
And then other forms of treatment were hydrotherapy, which is when you fill up one bathtub with extremely hot water and then you fill another one up with extremely cold water, and you take the patient from one to the other to shock their system.
Were lobotomies a thing then, or?
So, not from what I can tell. Lobotomies really started to become prevalent in the early 1940s and into the 1950s. Almost 20,000 lobotomies had been performed in the United States and proportionally more in the United Kingdom. So they were performing them in the 1940s and 50s, but for the time frame that we're talking about, it wasn't as prevalent. No, or I say it wasn't as prevalent, it wasn't happening yet.
Gotcha.
Another thing to note is that patients would often fake that the treatments were working so they could get out.
I mean, you can't really blame them.
No, not at all. Especially if it was, from the pictures I've seen, from the research I've done, if insane asylums were as crappy as they looked, I would fake to get out too.
Right. I'm sure they were miserable. Whether or not they needed to be there or not, I'm sure they were just trying to get out.
Another thing that I found to be particularly interesting was I found this list that's been floating around on the internet for some time, and it lists reasons why patients were admitted to the asylums. Some were laziness, novel reading.
Oh my God.
Patients were cousins.
What?
Politics, masturbation, menstruation, pregnancy. One was that someone was kicked in the head by a horse. Which, I mean, it probably did cause some sort of traumatic brain injury.
Yeah,
if you got
exactly.
kicked in the head by a horse. That list was taken from the logbook of the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, documenting admissions to the institution between 1864 and 1889. So I just thought the time frame was pretty fitting. Even though it wasn't in reference to the asylum that Fritz was put into, it speaks for the time.
Sure.
The hospital claimed to treat patients suffering from chronic dementia, acute mania, chronic mania, and melancholia, which would be, by our definition, depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, all of those things. I think it's fair to say that at the time that Fritz was committed to this asylum, there's plenty of evidence that would support why he wouldn't want to go back, ever. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from what you've told me, it sounds like these asylums were absolutely miserable, and I don't know a single person who would want to stay in one.
Shortly after Fritz arrived, he was evaluated by a psychologist and deemed incurably deranged and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered by the state to be incarcerated indefinitely at the mental asylum. But just 7 months later, Fritz escaped the mental asylum and fled to Zurich, Switzerland. He was only in Switzerland for 16 months, working as a handyman in a shipyard before returning to his hometown of Hanover. At this time, Fritz was just 20 years old, and it was this return that prompted a new period where he attempted to live a seemingly normal life. He met a local girl named Erna Lowert, and the two became engaged. This engagement overjoyed Fritz's parents, who hoped that this was what he needed to straighten out his life. Unfortunately, this wasn't to be. After Fritz learned that Erna was pregnant with their child, Fritz decided to abandon his commitment to his family and re-enlist in the military under a new identity, since his prior medical diagnosis wouldn't have allowed him to re-enroll. A year went by, and Haarmann was the happiest he had ever been. His fellow soldiers said that he was, quote, an exemplary soldier and excellent marksman, unquote. However, this bliss would only last a short time. After collapsing from a seizure during a training exercise, his chain of command had no choice but to discharge him. I think it's important that we talk about how him being discharged from the army could have affected his ego.
Absolutely. I feel like his whole life, he was just trying to prove that he was this man, despite the way that his family treated him. And so this was like his way to show everybody, hey, look, I can do this. But then he has what? A seizure, and he has to be sent home. So I can imagine the almost like heartbreak of, okay, failure. Like I can't even do this. What kind of man am I?
Absolutely. And not to mention, at this time, World War I was commencing. Most German men were joining the military to serve their countries. And how much of a stab that would have been for him not to be able to do the things that other people were doing.
Right. And at that time, that was what you just did.
Right.
The men went in the military. They fought the war. That had to be very frustrating for him to have to come home and tell his family and, tell the people he knew what happened. It's not like he was coming home to this warm, welcoming home. He was coming home to a disaster.
Right. Coming home to a father that basically shunned him
Mm-hmm.
and pushing down his feminine qualities that repulsed his dad. And that's sad. That's disheartening. And that probably made him just feel like a total failure, like you said.
Mm-hmm. He's like, great. Can't even do that. What now?
Not to mention, now he's facing it head on. He's got this mental disability. Shouldn't even call seizures mental disabilities, but back then that's what they were considered. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you know, having seizures could have probably put you in an insane asylum. Not only was he feeling like a failure, but he was also being told that he wasn't able to continue doing something that actually made him happy. Because there is a lot of research saying that this was one of the happiest times in his life, being in the military, having a purpose. When you feel like you don't have that purpose anymore, you don't have that end goal, there is no light at the end of that tunnel, they become dark.
Absolutely.
A disheartened Fritz returned home to Hanover, only to the dismay of his father, who tried to have him committed back to the asylum. Fritz was now a free man with no wife, no family, and no support. Over the next 2 decades, Haarmann spent several years in and out of state prisons for crimes such as theft, scams, smuggling runs, and embezzlement. He also continued committing sexual offenses, but it was rarely reported to the police due to the victim's embarrassment. It was also during this time that a partnership bloomed with a young man named Hans Grans. The two were very much in love, and I believe that this was when Haarmann started to feel comfortable in his skin. Yet, even though he was embracing his true nature, it still wasn't enough. Fritz didn't just enjoy the company of men, he enjoyed the company of little boys. Moreover, Haarmann had learned from his past mistakes. If he left living victims, there would be living accusers. It was this next chapter in Fritz's life that would commence the crime spree that would ultimately define everything that we will come to learn about this grotesque and sadistic man. A few points here that I think we should talk about are homosexuality and pedophilia in the 19th century. I think we should discuss Hans Grans and Fritz's relationship. I also think we should talk a little bit about Hans Grans just as a person and his background. And I think we should also discuss how and when did Fritz flip his switch? Or was it always flipped? So let's start with homosexuality and pedophilia in the 19th century. So from what I've found, homosexuality and pedophilia at this time was not the object of concern. So from most of this research from the Victorian era, pedophilia was seldom discussed and was considered a rare occurrence, just as homosexuality was. So I think we can deduct that both of these things were not something that happened frequently. They also were not linked together. In Fritz's case, the two things are linked together. He was, in fact, a homosexual. He was, in fact, molesting boys. He would rather have the company of boys than just a man. So clearly the two things were intertwined.
Sure.
A famous psychologist by the name of Sigmund Freud, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with, described the sexual interest in children as a sporadic aberration, and he who exhibits pedophilia is someone who is cowardly or who has become impotent. I think that's a pretty interesting way of describing it. Also, back then, there, like we've said, wasn't a whole lot of research being done on homosexuality and pedophilia.
Right.
So the link between the two, or the link that makes one person a pedophile, wasn't something that was just openly discussed.
Right. Yeah. Even it was so rare that it was happening and nobody was talking about it.
No. And I mean, we talked about in the episode how victims weren't even going to the police because they were so embarrassed. Because back then, homosexuality was illegal. If you were found to like someone of the same sex, you were thrown in jail.
Jeez.
Which I can't even imagine. Not being able to be the person you are, they're just going to throw you in jail?
Right. Yeah, when talking about homosexuality, it breaks my heart that these people they just wanted somebody to love. They just wanted to be honest and, true about who they were. And the fact that they were getting arrested, treated nasty, and, thrown in jail for these things, it's awful.
So segueing that into Fritz's relationship with Hans Grans, and we can talk a little bit about him. Hans Franz himself spent a pretty large portion of his life as a criminal, petty thief. He ran away from home. He made his living by selling old clothes. And at the time when he met Fritz, he offered to prostitute himself in exchange for money.
What?
Yeah, so their relationship kind of started on a criminal act in itself.
Not the most conventional way to meet somebody.
Yeah, but I mean, conventional or not, these two fall in love.
Yeah.
It was almost like you said, a relief, a match made in heaven at that time, because they both did want the company of men.
Right. And how it started, I mean, they eventually formed a friendship and then obviously a romantic relationship. So I'm sure that was somewhat of a relief to Fritz to, have finally found someone who he can be his true self with.
Absolutely. Because think about it, all this time, Fritz grows up as a young boy, and deep down, he knows that he likes men.
Mm-hmm.
And he's pushed this feeling down and pushed this feeling aside, and he's done everything in his power to not truly accept who he really is.
Mm-hmm.
And then he meets this man, and from all accounts that I've read, all the research I've done, they were in love. They were very much in love. And I don't want to give you guys any spoilers for our next episode, but these two men were in love. There's nothing that tells me otherwise. So I think that's, something beautiful in itself.
Mm-hmm,
now,
absolutely.
What's not beautiful is what comes later. But obviously, both of these men, too, on the flip side, were very troubled. Both were committing petty crimes. They both had pretty harsh upbringings. And this, of course, led to some really unfortunate events that we're going to talk about in next week's episode. Let's talk about when Fritz flipped this switch, or if was that switch always flipped. In my opinion, the switch flipped when Fritz was a very young boy. And I don't know if you remember me talking about this in the story, but there was a point where Fritz was displaying malevolent behavior. He was tapping on his sister's windows and tying them up in order to scare them.
Right.
And I think that is when his intent became malevolent.
It was almost like a test to be like, okay, how does this feel? What am I kind of getting out of these things that I'm doing?
Right. And that behavior ultimately got him sent away to military school because his parents were like, F it, we need you to not act out.
Mm-hmm. Straighten up.
Exactly. And for his dad, I think a lot of it too was he wanted him to toughen up.
Right.
He wanted him to stop acting like one of his sisters, which we can all probably deduce that he couldn't help it. These feminine feelings were brewing inside of Fritz his entire life.
Right. No matter how much they tried to push them down or cover it up, they always popped through.
Absolutely. Once he's, sent away to military school, he's having these seizures. He's sent home. At the time, they're not sure what seizures really are. They just called it, these lapses in consciousness.
Right. I'm sure if they consider you reading or being lazy as that being a mental illness, I'm sure a seizure, probably they were categorizing it the same way.
Oh, absolutely. If somebody fell on the ground, was convulsing, they were probably scared beyond their wits. They were like,
hang on a minute.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with you, but
yeah,
you're not normal. That's so sad, right? Like,
right.
I don't like to call Fritz a victim here, but I think his childhood lent itself to a psychopath.
Yeah, it did not set him up for success, that's for sure.
No, absolutely not. I think it's safe to say that Fritz was a troubled youth. But before we give you too much, because we want you to tune in next week for part 2, I'll conclude with this rhyme I found about Fritz Haarmann. And trust me, you'll want to tune in next week. Just you wait till it's your time. Haarmann will come after you. With his chopper, oh so fine, he'll make mincemeat out of you. If you liked our podcast and want us to keep going, just hit subscribe or rate and review. We appreciate all your feedback.
If you want more info about this case and the wine we selected for this week's episode, check out our show notes. Thanks for listening.
Until next time, set your alarms, lock your doors, drink some water, and don't text your ex.
Stay weird, friends.